Hello again. So this is part 2 of the preview, the events that are leading up to the War for Independence. This podcast takes off where the French Indian War or the 7 Years' War ended. So what happened was basically North America was reshuffled in terms of which European country owned which region. However, the Indians, of course, were not really part of this negotiation. They were not happy with this negotiation. The Indians that had backed the French, of course, lost their French allies. They were out of ammunition. They were out of people. But in May of 1763, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, and the Huron decided to attack Fort Detroit. This launches what is known as Pontiac's War. Now, their objective, of course, like all the other objectives of the Indian Wars, is to keep the Europeans out of their land. However, as we are going to find out, this is not successful. So there were massacres, according to your textbook, of whites and as well as of Native Americans. More than 400 British soldiers were killed. 2,000 colonists were killed or taken captive. And the war basically comes to a war of attrition. They basically have run out of ammunition. Like I said, they don't have any more allies. They're basically just out of luck, out of people. And the British, on the other hand, are also low on money, because again, money is how you pay for wars, and they're also done. They're done with all these wars. They want to just get things settled and get on with being part of the North American great imperial empire that they were. Okay, so what that leads to is the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It's supposed to protect the integrity of Indian territory by forbidding colonists to settle west of the Appalachians. However, of course, there were people already there, and there were people who were European people who were not interested in following the Royal Proclamation. But at the time, it appeased the Native Americans to a certain point. So, if you look at our schedule, we've got in the Foner book, we have Pontiac's 2 speeches. So let's take a look at those real quick. Those are document 30. So in my book, in my yellow Voices of Freedom 7th edition, volume 1, that is going to be on page 90. So Pontiac gives 2 speeches, one in 1762 and the other one in 1763. The introduction says, victory in the 7 Years' War confirmed with the Treaty of Paris of 1763, which was the end of the 7 Years' War, established British preeminence in North America east of the Mississippi River. To the Indians, it was clear that the abrupt departure of the French from Canada and the Mississippi and Ohio valleys and the continued expansion of British settler population posed a dire threat. And of course, they were correct in their predictions. So, here is what Pontiac had to say with his with promoting his pan-Indian identity in order to rally the Indian nations to fight English settlement, to fight European settlement in general. So this is what he says: Englishmen, although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these mountains and woods, were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to no one. Your nation supposes that we, like the white people, cannot live without bread and pork and beef, but you ought to know that He, the Great Spirit and Master of life, has provided food for us in these spacious lakes and on these woody mountains. So what he's saying is, these have been our lands for a very long time. Very long time. And we don't need to be farmers. We do farm a little bit, but we don't rely on it the way that the English do. we don't need your help. We just need to be left alone to live our lives. He goes on to say in his second speech, a Delaware Indian, Neolin, said Pontiac, conceived an eager desire to learn wisdom from the Master of Life, but, being ignorant where to find him, he had recourse to fasting, dreaming, and magical incantations. It was by these means that it was revealed to him that by moving forward in a straight, undeviating course, he would reach the abode of the Great Spirit. He told his purpose to no one, and having provided the equipment of a hunter, gun, powder horn, ammunition, and kettle for preparing his food, he set out on his errand. Again, that's what they are saying. They don't need help. So who is Neolin? Neolin is a Delaware religious prophet, and Pontiac is going to talk about how Neolin came to his great revelation. And the revelation moves on to after he has been fasting and has been on his vision quest. He remembers that the important object of his journey. He could not neither rest or sleep, and leaving his fire, he crossed the meadow and entered the largest of the 3 openings. There were 3 openings in the woods. He had advanced but a short distance into the forest when a bright flame sprang out of the ground before him and stopped him in his steps. In great amazement he turned back and entered the second path, where the same wonderful phenomenon again encountered him. And now, in terror and bewilderment, yet still resolved to persevere, he took the last of the 3 paths. On this he journeyed a whole day without interruption, so the other 2 paths were blocked to him. When at length, emerging from the forest, he saw before him a vast mountain of dazzling whiteness. So precipitous was the ascent that the Indian thought it was hopeless to go farther, and looked around him in despair. At that moment he saw, seated in some distance above, the figure of a beautiful woman arrayed in white, who arose as he looked upon her and thus accosted him, "How can you hope, encumbered as you are, to succeed in your design? Go down to the foot of the mountain, throw away your gun, your ammunition, your provisions, your clothing, wash yourself in the stream which flows there, and you will then be prepared to stand before the Master of Life." So he was on his path to meet the Master of Life, to find out what the meaning of all this conflict was about. But instead he encountered this beautiful woman in white, who said, "You're not ready to see the Master of Life. Go back down and get yourself prepared." The Indian obeyed, and again began to ascend among the rocks, while the woman, seeing him still discouraged, laughed at his faintness of heart and told him that if he wished for success he must climb by the aid of 1 hand and 1 foot only. After great toil and suffering he at length found himself at the summit. The woman had disappeared, and he was left alone. A rich and beautiful plain lay before him, and at a little distance he saw 3 great villages, far superior to the squalid wigwams of the Delawares. As he approached the largest and stood hesitating whether he should enter, a man gorgeously attired stepped forth, and taking him by the hand, welcomed him to the celestial abode. He then conducted him into the presence of the Great Spirit, where the Indian stood confounded at the unspeakable splendor which surrounded him. The Great Spirit bade him be seated, and thus addressed him: "I am the maker of heaven and earth, the trees, lakes, rivers, and all things else. I am the maker of mankind, and because I love you, you must do my will. The land on which you live I have made for you, and not for others. Why do you suffer the white men to dwell among you? In other words, why do you let them be here? My children, you have not forgotten the customs and traditions of your forefathers. Why do you not clothe yourselves in skins as they did, and use the bows and arrows and stone-pointed lances which they used? You have brought guns, knives, kettles, and blankets from the white men, until you can no longer do without them. In other words, now you're dependent on them. And what is worse, you have drunk the poison fire water, which turns you into fools. In other words, alcohol. Fling all these things away, live as your wise forefathers lived before you. And as for these English, these dogs dressed in red, who have come to rob you of your hunting grounds and drive away your game, you must lift the hatchet against them. Wipe them from the face of the earth, and then you will win my favor back again and once more be happy and prosperous." So the questions at the ending of this is, how does Pontiac understand the meaning of freedom? Now you have an assignment that where you watch a different video, But I want you to really think about freedom. Freedom is going to be important when we get, throughout American history, let's just say it that way, including freedom for settlers, freedom for white men, freedom for white women, freedom for Indians, freedom for immigrants, freedom for, of course, the enslaved peoples, freedom for those who then no longer are enslaved. But freedom is an important concept for America. So what does Pontiac think about the meaning of freedom? And then the second question is, what elements of Indian life does Neolin criticize most strongly? Well, of course, he criticizes the anglicizing of Native Americans altogether. Go back to the ways, and then the master of life, God, will be on your side again. The Indians have let go of their past. They've let go of who they were. And in return, they are now no longer protected by God. So that's what's going on with the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And of course, white settlers are going to ignore that. And one disastrous, unsuccessful attempt for Indians to put down their rivalries, put down their conflicts, and come together as one in order to fight off the British colonists. And of course, they were unsuccessful, like I said. Okay. So in the next podcast, I'm going to talk about all the ways that the British government come up with in order to pay for these wars.